My name is Sylvia Crane. I'm 44. For months ago I stood in a county auction house in rural Vermont and watched a man I had not seen in 22 years bid against me for my grandmother's house. Not a stranger. My uncle. Franklin Crane, my father's younger brother, who had left our family's orbit when I was 22 after a conflict so serious and so deliberately unresolved that his name had become, in the years since, one of those family words that produces a specific quality of silence in the room when it is spoken. He was standing 12 feet away from me on the other side of the auction room when the bidding opened, and I did not recognize him immediately because 22 years changes a person and because I was not expecting him and because the possibility of his presence in that room had not occurred to me as something to prepare for. When I realized who he was, the bidding was already at $140,000, and I was the current high bidder. Franklin had just raised his paddle, and the auctioneer was calling $145. Before I tell you what happened when the bidding ended and I walked across that room and stood in front of him for the first time in 22 years, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this started. I need to tell you about my grandmother, Eleanor Crane, before I tell you about the auction. Because Eleanor is the reason the house existed, the reason the auction happened, and the reason Franklin was in that room, and understanding her requires understanding something about the specific kind of woman she was and what she believed about the things she built and the people she built them with. Eleanor was 83 when she died. She had lived in the same house in rural Vermont for 51 years, a white farmhouse on 12 acres of land that she and my grandfather had purchased in 1972, the year they moved from Connecticut in the specific way that people moved to Vermont in the 1970s, leaving behind careers and suburban arrangements for something that felt more intentional, more connected to the actual texture of daily life. My grandfather, Robert Crane, had been a high school history teacher. Eleanor had been a librarian. They were not wealthy people, and they had not purchased the farmhouse as an investment or as a statement but as a home, the specific kind of home that people build their entire lives around and that accumulates, across 50 years of occupation, a density of meaning that is completely disproportionate to its market value. Robert died in 2009. Eleanor stayed. She had grown her own vegetables in the garden on the south side of the house since 1973. She had maintained the property with the specific stubborn competence of a woman who had never believed that things needed to be done for her that she could do herself. She had driven herself to town until she was 81, which was the age at which her doctor and her optometrist had finally, together, persuaded her that driving was no longer safe. After which she had arranged her own ride schedule through a combination of neighbors and the local senior transport service with the same methodical independence she brought to everything else in her life, visited her 4 times a year, every year, for as long as I could remember and as long as she was alive. Not because anyone required it. Because Eleanor was the person in my family I most wanted to spend time with, the specific person whose company produced in me the feeling that I was being seen clearly and responded to accurately, the quality I have described in other stories on this channel and that I think is rarer than any of us knows until we have lost the person who provided it. My father, James Crane, was Eleanor's older son. He died 7 years ago, of a long illness that gave us time to prepare without making the preparation feel like adequate compensation for the actual loss. My uncle Franklin was Eleanor's younger son. He had left our family's orbit 22 years before the auction, after a conflict with my father that my grandmother had described to me, over the years, in the specific carefully managed way she described things she found painful, as a disagreement about money and about what family meant and about whether there were some things that could not be undone. She had maintained contact with Franklin throughout the 22 years of his estrangement from the broader family, meeting him sometimes for lunch when he was in her part of the state, exchanging letters in the way she exchanged letters with everyone she cared about, refusing to allow the conflict between her sons to determine the boundaries of her own relationships. She had told me this. What she had not told me, in any of the 4 times yearly visits across the preceding decade, was what she had told her attorney about what she wanted done with the house after she died. Eleanor's will was simple in most respects. Her personal effects were divided among her grandchildren per a specific schedule she had attached. A modest investment account was divided equally between Franklin and my father's estate, meaning his share passed to me as his only child, which is the standard mechanism for inheritance when a named beneficiary has predeceased the testator. The farmhouse, however, was not addressed in the will as I had expected. Eleanor had left the farmhouse to no one specifically. She had directed, instead, that the property be sold at public auction with the proceeds divided equally between Franklin and my father's estate, meaning Franklin and me. She had left a letter with her attorney, addressed to both Franklin and me, explaining her reasoning, which the attorney read to us separately, Franklin receiving his copy in a different meeting, on the same day. I want to tell you what that letter said before I tell you what happened at the auction, because the letter is the key to everything, and without it the auction is simply a family conflict over real estate rather than what it actually was, which was Eleanor speaking from beyond her death with the specific clarity she had applied to everything while she was alive. She wrote, "Sylvia and Franklin, I am leaving the farmhouse to auction rather than to either of you because I could not find a way to be fair to both of you that also honored what the house actually is. The house is not an investment property. It is the place where our family has existed for 51 years. It is the garden I planted the year Nixon resigned and the kitchen table where your grandfather wrote his lesson plans and the porch where I have watched every Vermont autumn since 1972. I do not believe that property of this kind should be distributed on the basis of whose legal claim is stronger. I believe it should go to the person who loves it enough to bid for it honestly, in public, in the knowledge that the other person is in the same room and has the same right." She wrote, "I have spoken with my attorney about what this means legally, and it means that you will both receive written notice of the auction date and you will both have the right to bid and the proceeds will be divided equally regardless of who wins. What I want you to understand is that I am not asking you to bid against each other as enemies. I am asking you to be in the same room for the first time in 22 years and to let the house decide, in the only honest way I can think of, who is meant to have it." She wrote, "There is one more thing I need to tell you, and I have instructed my attorney to share this information with both of you before the auction rather than after, because I believe you each deserve to know it before you make your decision. I left Franklin a sum of money separately from the estate, outside the will, transferred as a gift during my lifetime specifically so that it would be available to him for the auction if he chose to use it. The amount is $150,000. I am telling you this, Sylvia, because I believe that going into the auction without knowing this would be unfair to you. I am telling you this, Franklin, because I believe that going into the auction with a secret advantage over your niece would be something you would not want once you understood it." I read that letter twice in the attorney's office. Then I set it down on the desk and looked at the attorney, a careful woman named Susan Marsh who had known Eleanor for decades and who was watching me with the specific expression of someone who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned to give the receiving of it the space it requires. I said, "She gave him the money to bid with." Susan said, "She gave him the money during her lifetime as a gift. What he chooses to do with it is entirely his decision." I said, "Did she tell him why she was giving it to him?" Susan said, "She wrote him a letter with the gift." I don't have the contents of that letter. I only know she wrote one. I sat in the attorney's office for a few more minutes without saying anything. I thought about Eleanor, about the 4 times yearly visits, about the garden on the south side and the kitchen table and the Vermont autumns from the porch. I thought about Franklin, whom I had not seen in 22 years and whose existence had been, for most of my adult life, a word that produced silence. I thought about what it meant that Eleanor had given him $150,000 and then told me she had given it to him and told him that she had told me, and I understood, sitting in that attorney's office, that the transparency was the point. She had not wanted either of us to win by surprise. She had wanted us both to walk into that auction room with complete information and to make our decisions fully knowing what we were deciding. Want to tell you about the weeks between reading the letter and the auction date, because those weeks were not passive and what I did in them matters to understanding who I was when I walked into that auction room, called my cousin Patricia, Franklin's daughter, whom I had known as a child and had had no contact with in the 22 years of the estrangement. Patricia and I had found each other on social media years ago and had a peripheral awareness of each other's lives without having any actual relationship. I called her number, which I found without difficulty, on a Tuesday evening, and she answered, and there was a brief moment of mutual recognition followed by the specific awkward warmth of two people who share a history they have not shared in a long time. Fed, Patricia, I think you know why I'm calling. She said, the house? I said, yes. She said, Dad told me about the letter. About the money Grandma gave him. I said, I know about it too. She said, Sylvia, I want you to know that Dad is in a very different place than he was 22 years ago. He's been different for a long time. I said, I believe you. She said, do you know what happened between him and your dad? I said, I know my father's version. She said, do you want to know Dad's version? I said, yes, she told me. I am not going to tell you the specific content of what Franklin's version of the 22-year-old conflict contained, both because the conflict itself is not the center of this story and because some things that belong to families and do not need to be fully unpacked in every forum. What I will tell you is that hearing Franklin's version of the conflict, through Patricia, did not make my father wrong and did not make Franklin right, but it made both of them human in a way that the single version story I had been living inside for 22 years had not fully allowed. Two men who had loved each other and who had arrived at something neither of them knew how to walk back from and who had both, in the years since, carried the specific weight of an unresolved thing that had never been given the chance to resolve. I asked Patricia if Franklin was planning to attend the auction. She said, yes. I said, is he planning to bid? She said, I think so. I said, do you know why? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because Grandma asked him to. Because she asked him to be in that room and to let whatever happens happen honestly. I said, she asked me the same thing. I arrived at the auction house 40 minutes early. The property had been listed and advertised through the standard auction process, which meant there were other bidders in the room, people who had seen the listing and assessed the 12 acres and the farmhouse's condition and the Vermont real estate market and decided it was worth attending. 7 bidders in total, based on the paddles distributed at registration. I was number 4. I did not know, when I registered, which of the other 6 was Franklin. Found out when the bidding opened and moved quickly through its early stages. The auctioneers practiced rhythm, pushing the price through 80,000, 90,000, 100,000, most of the registered bidders dropping out as the number climbed, until at 120,000 there were 3 paddles still active. Mine, number 4. An older man in a barn jacket who appeared to be a local property investor based on the way he was watching the auctioneer rather than the room. And a third bidder I had not been watching closely enough, standing on the far side of the room, whose paddle I tracked back to a face I did not immediately recognize as belonging to anyone I knew. The barn jacket man dropped at 130,000. The bidding continued between my paddle and the one across the room. 135. 140. I raised my paddle. 145. The other paddle went up. I looked at the face attached to it, more carefully this time, and something in the specific set of the jaw and the way the eyes were tracking the auctioneer produced a recognition that arrived not as a sudden realization but as a slow, specific assembling of features into a face I had last seen when both of us were decades younger. Franklin Crane was 61 years old. He had the same jaw as my father. That was the thing that hit me first and that I was not prepared for. The specific genetic inheritance of a facial feature I had associated my entire life with my father, and that was now, across a room, attached to a man I had not seen in 22 years. He was watching the auctioneer with the concentrated attention of someone who is doing something that costs them something, not just money but something more personal, and I understood in that moment that whatever Eleanor had written in the letter she sent with the $150,000, whatever she had said to bring him to this room, had been something significant enough to produce this specific quality of concentrated presence in a man who had every reason to have stayed away. 150,000. My paddle. 155,000. Franklin's paddle. I want to tell you what I felt at that moment, because the feeling was not what I expected, and I think the unexpected quality of it matters. I had expected to feel competitive. I had expected to feel, given the family history and the 22-year absence and the $150,000 Eleanor had given him specifically for this purpose, something like adversarial clarity, the clean, focused feeling of someone in a contest where the stakes are clear and the goal is to win. What I felt instead was something more complicated. I felt the specific strange sensation of being in a room with someone I had grieved without acknowledging that I had grieved them, the particular uncategorized loss of a person who was not dead but was absent, and the recognition that this specific person, this uncle with my father's jaw, had also been grieving something across 22 years, had also been carrying the unresolved weight of a family conflict that neither party had found a way to address, and was now in this room because an 83-year-old woman who loved both of them had decided that an auction was the most honest mechanism she could design for putting them in the same space. 160,000. My paddle. I raised it knowing, as I raised it, that I was not going to raise it again. Not because I had run out of money. I had the resources to go higher. I had come to this auction prepared to spend significantly more than $160,000 for the farmhouse on 12 acres where Eleanor had watched 50 Vermont autumns from the porch. I raised it, and I looked across the room at Franklin, and I made a decision that I had not made consciously and that I understood, as I was making it, to be the thing Eleanor had actually been hoping for when she designed this situation. 165,000. Franklin's paddle. Final. I did not raise mine. The auctioneer called the number 3 times, the standard procedure, and then brought down the gavel, and Franklin Crane became the owner of Eleanor's farmhouse, and I was standing in the county auction house in rural Vermont, having just not bid against my uncle in a way that was as deliberate as any bid I had ever made, walked across the room. I want to tell you about those 12 feet because they felt like a distance that required something more than walking. 12 feet of auction house floor between me and a man who had my father's jaw and who had just bought the house where my father had grown up and where I had spent 4 times yearly for decades, eating from the garden on the south side and sitting at the kitchen table and watching the Vermont autumn from the porch. He saw me coming. He did not look away. He stood very still. I said, "Franklin." He said, "Sylvia." His voice was lower than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply forgotten the specific quality of it across 22 years of not hearing it. He said, "I didn't know you would be here." I said, "Eleanor's attorney told me you would be." He said, "She told me you would be too." We looked at each other for a moment in the specific suspended way of people who have not spoken in 22 years and who are trying to locate, somewhere in the present face of the other person, the face they remember from before. He said, "Why did you stop bidding?" I said, "Because Eleanor didn't design this situation so that one of us would win. She designed it so that we would be in the same room. I've been in the same room. The rest is yours." His jaw did the thing my father's jaw did when my father was trying not to show that something had affected him. He said, she told me, in the letter with the money, that she had been waiting 22 years for me to find my way back. She said she couldn't make me do it, but she could give me a door, and she hoped I would walk through it. I said, you walked through it. He said, so did you. He stood in the auction house for another 30 minutes, not leaving, not quite knowing yet how to occupy the space we had entered together. He told me he had 2 daughters, Patricia, whom I had spoken with, and a younger one named Elena whom I had never met. He told me he had been a high school history teacher for 18 years, the same profession as my grandfather, which he described with the specific self-aware humor of someone who has thought about that parallel more than once. He asked about my work and about my life in the years since we had last been in the same room, and I told him, briefly, the outline of it, the kind of outline you give someone who has been absent for 22 years and with whom you are beginning, in the specific careful way of new beginnings, to establish what the relationship will look like now that the absence is over. Before we left, he said, I want to take care of the house the way she did. I said, I know. He said, I want you to be able to come back whenever you want. It should still be a place you can come to. I said, thank you. He said, she asked me to make that offer in the letter with the money. She was very specific about it. I said, that's her. He said, yes. That's exactly her. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after the auction, because the resolution was not complete in the auction house and the months since have contained things that matter to the complete picture. Franklin and I have spoken 4 times since the auction. Not long calls, not the calls of people who have seamlessly resumed a relationship after 22 years, but careful, honest, somewhat tentative calls that are building something in the specific slow way that genuine things are built. He has asked about my memories of Eleanor, and I have shared them, and he has shared his, and the sharing has produced, in both of us, I think, something that is greater than the sum of its parts. The specific enrichment that comes from understanding a person you loved through another person who also loved them from a different angle, has been back to the farmhouse twice since the auction, working with a local contractor on some deferred maintenance that Eleanor had allowed to accumulate in her final years. He sent me photographs of the garden on the south side, still in its late-season state, the canes wrapped in burlap exactly as Eleanor had always prepared them. He sent me a photograph of the kitchen table. I kept both photographs. Patricia called me the week after the auction to tell me that her father had come home from Vermont and had cried for the first time in years, the specific crying that comes not from sadness but from something resolving that has been unresolved for a long time. She said, he has my grandfather's history textbooks from the farmhouse. Grandma left them to him specifically. He put them on his shelf and just stood there looking at them for a while. I said, I'm glad he has them. She said, Sylvia, thank you for not outbidding him. I said, Eleanor did the work. I just didn't get in the way of it. My share of the auction proceeds was $82,500, half of the $165,000 sale price. I used it to establish a small library fund at the town library in Eleanor's Vermont community, the library where she had spent 30 years as a librarian and volunteer, designated to purchase books for the children's section in perpetuity. The library sent me a small plaque they installed near the children's reading corner with Eleanor's name and the years of her service. I have a photograph of it on my phone. I look at it more than I would admit in most company. I want to talk to you directly now, wherever you are, whatever time it is. Eleanor Crane was 83 years old when she died, and she had spent, by my best estimate, the last decade of her life thinking about how to use what she had to say the things she had not been able to say directly. She gave Franklin money, and she gave me notice of the money. She created an auction, and she made sure we both knew the other would be there. She wrote letters that explained her reasoning with a clarity she had sometimes struggled to apply in direct conversation. She was not a woman who always said the right thing in the moment. She was a woman who, given enough time, figured out how to create the conditions for the right thing to happen. She could not fix the 22-year estrangement. She could not give my father back to me or give Franklin the years he had lost with his brother or give me the uncle I had effectively lost when I was 22. What she could do was put two people in a room and tell them both the truth about the situation and trust that the truth, given enough light, would do what truth sometimes does when the people in its presence are willing to let it. I let it. Franklin let it. 12 feet of auction house floor became the shortest long distance I have ever traveled. I'm going back to Vermont in the spring. Franklin has invited me. The garden will need planting, and he said he does not know enough about what Eleanor grew and in what order, and I told him I could remember most of it, and he said, then come and tell me. I said, I'll come and tell you. And show you. And we'll do it together. Eleanor would have found something to say about that. She would have made it seem less significant than it was in the specific way she made most significant things seem, a comment about the specific variety of tomatoes she preferred or the correct depth for planting the garlic, and underneath the comment the thing she actually meant, which was that the garden was the place where she had always done her best thinking and she was glad it was going to be tended by people who understood what it was for. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is and whether there is someone in your life the distance with whom could be closed by the right room at the right moment, if someone wise enough to design that moment ever got around to it. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here.